Good evening, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Talking Point. My name is Fahraaz Patel. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us here on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. The United States of America is heading into a new era, but with a familiar face. Donald Trump will return to the White House in 2 months' time, and it comes at a moment where there are more questions than answers, concerns, and bigger questions with regards to where America is heading, not only domestically, but also in terms of its foreign policy. 2 weeks ago, citizens of the United States of America voted for Donald Trump to return to the White House. This comes after he, of course, served as president from 2016 to 2020 until he lost that year's election to Joe Biden. It ends the Democratic rule of 4 years and returns the Republican rule to Capitol Hill. Of course, this was an election that saw other political parties contesting. One of that, of course, being the Green Party, and that of Dr. Jill Stein. Questions, of course, with regards to where do third-party politics or third-party representation fits within the United States comes into question. Dr. Jill Stein joins me now via Zoom, and she is currently in Boston, Massachusetts. Dr. Stein, thank you so much for joining us here on Talking Point on Hilaal TV. We did talk off air. This is the first time you're speaking on a South African media platform, so it's an absolute honor and pleasure to have you on.
Likewise, it's a great honor to be here. We're all very thankful to South Africa these days.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Dr. Stein, talking about South Africa, when you speak to many South African citizens, those, of course, who have solidarity with Palestine, if they were to be given the opportunity to vote in the United States, they were choosing neither Republican or Democrat. I'm sure that must be bringing a lot of joy to you, because they said they would vote for the Green Party under Dr. Jill Stein.
Yes, I mean, this has been a truly historic campaign. It has put the Green Party into the number 3 position among political parties, but we point out that we're really in the number 1 position if you are looking at people-powered parties rather than the parties who are sponsored by Wall Street and the war machine.
Dr. Stein, domestic policy of the United States of America. I'm going to touch on Elon Musk in a bit, because it's been obviously a discussion here in South Africa with regards to what is he going to do. Is there going to be a capture of the United States of America? Donald Trump's domestic policy has really brought about a lot of controversy, especially when we look at the Black Lives Matter, when the murders of African Americans were happening with the brutality of the police, especially in the South. What is the real feeling amongst the Americans with Donald Trump returning? Because one can only imagine there is tons of concern with him returning back.
Yes, there absolutely is, but it's important to remember that things have not been going well, not for African Americans, not for Muslim Americans, not for working Americans, young people. The economic environment and the social environment has been very, very difficult. And I think many people voted for Donald Trump in order to cast a vote against the Democrats. Over 60% of Americans, and rising actually, are struggling living paycheck to paycheck. Half of Americans cannot afford their rent and are living, again, in the hopes that they not lose a paycheck and lose their rental housing and so on. So things have been very difficult for Americans. And unfortunately, the Democratic Party spent a huge amount of money to smear and to suppress knowledge of other options. And many Americans stayed home more than usual. At least 1/3 out of the American electorate does not vote, and even more than that this time. And these are largely people of color, younger, and lower income. So there's an enormous demographic that really is hungry for change, but they are not able to hear about their options that would actually serve them. And, I think that went a long way to decide the outcome in this election.
You bring up that there are many Americans that are staying at home. You've got Boeing that is, of course, looking to retrench workers. You've got this pending U.S. steel purchase from Nippon Steel from Japan, which, of course, the discussion about foreign investment coming in could see potential layoff of staff. That in itself brings a lot of questions in terms of where America is heading from its economic perspective, especially now when you are seeing much more of an isolation of the West with the rise of BRICS, with the rising global South perspective that is coming into the picture. How much of that concerns Americans, knowing that sooner or later there's going to be a complete isolation of the West, and that's going to include their very own country if they do not have a leader that can really speak and connect with the global South in quite an aggressive way?
Yes, and this growing isolation of the U.S. and its growing, shall we say, loss of economic domination. It's very much the chickens coming home to roost here on U.S. foreign policy, which has been a policy of economic and military domination for quite some time. In the early 1990s, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Pentagon actually articulated a policy called full spectrum dominance that remains in effect today. It's this notion that the U.S. needs to dominate all other countries and all other regions of the world and will not allow competitors to rise. This goes a long way to explain the aggressiveness and really the foolishness of U.S. foreign policy, which is now coming back to bite it in so many ways. And it's ironic because Donald Trump comes in promising to rely on tariffs to help the U.S. meet its budget deficit, and that's going to even create greater problems in terms of global trade, but also for the American people. This is going to continue to increase the cost of living and the costs of products. So he comes in, very much in a very counterproductive foreign policy tradition, and he may very well make that worse. If there's anything that describes Donald Trump, it's that he's unpredictable and he's mercurial. He changes all the time. So it's very hard to predict what way the country's going. And one other comment, which is that most Americans don't have a clue because our media will not discuss a more global perspective on our foreign policy. So most Americans are not aware whatsoever of the declining status of the U.S. and the rising power of the BRICS alliance.
I was watching the campaigning, including yours. I watched Kamala Harris, I watched Donald Trump, and there was one figure that lurked in the shadow and is, of course, rise from the shadow. That's none other than ex-chairman, owner, CEO. He goes under many titles. That's none other than Elon Musk. Now, of course, in many of your campaigns, in many of your speeches, Dr. Stein, you've mentioned that, we've got two political parties that have been really captured quite heavily by Wall Street and the capitalist environment within the United States of America. And it gets no bigger than that of Elon Musk. Are the Americans fearing something of some sort of a state capture? I ask this because here in South Africa, we lived through a period of what was termed state capture when we had big business, really influencing government decisions. And Elon Musk has now been included in this forthcoming cabinet of Donald Trump. It doesn't really spell anything great knowing that you've got a hardened capitalist in a hardened capitalist cabinet.
Absolutely. And I think, Donald Trump's election in itself reflects the corporate capture of our government and the fact that, people are really suffering. The rich are getting very much richer while our poverty rates among children have tripled and, Americans are increasingly struggling, which is why many went from voting Democrat to, trying out the Republicans really on really kind of a wing and a prayer. But what they're getting absolutely is even more corporate capture, and people don't know what to expect right now. There's a great fan club for Elon Musk, even though one of his rockets, I understand, got into a lot of trouble on its takeoff yesterday. But there is this illusion of, that he can't fail and that he can do everything. And, he's so rich, maybe he can bring those riches to the American people. But that's the illusion that surrounded Donald Trump in his first go in office. And, certainly he did no favors for the American people. Mainly what he accomplished were huge tax breaks for the wealthy. And, we are very likely to see more of that. I think the American people are in for quite a shock.
After the break, I want to actually touch on that, the taxing the wealth, which was discussed on the G20 summit, and that's going to lead to, of course, third-party discussion. Is there room for third party within the United States political and electoral sphere? I continue my conversation with Dr. Jill Stein after the break. Welcome back. I'm in conversation with Dr. Jill Stein. Of course, she was the Green Party leader for this year's U.S. presidential candidate race. Dr. Stein, before I touch on third-party politics and its room within the United States, I want to talk on the G20. Of course, Brazil has been pushing for a 2% taxation within the wealthy of the globe. Of course, this is going to come to the United States plate when we look at the masses of capitalists that operate within that country. Of course, the United States is seen as the sort of, quote unquote, and I'm going to use this word loosely, big brother in how the economic sphere of the world works. With Donald Trump in power, do you foresee this happening given the world's poverty and the growing aspect of it as the years go?
I think Donald Trump's election reflects the growing power of the economic elite in this country, and it will have very adverse, effects on policymaking that will affect economic growth and development, around the world, and also the condition of working people in this country. And again, it's not clear exactly what he's going to do, but his policy is definitely America first, with one exception, and that is that it seems to be Israel first, in fact, above America first, and his cabinet is loaded with diehard Zionists, and also with support in general for militarism and military solutions and deregulation. So it's very hard to see that this is going to advance justice and economic sustainability and sovereignty anywhere around the world.
Dr. Stein, let's talk about the elections that happened 2 weeks ago. As I mentioned, resounding win for the Republicans. It seems as if Congress is going to be quite full of Republican representatives. If I stand to be corrected, I think the threshold was 5% for third-party representation within the Senate and the Congress. Is the American electorate system ready for a full-out third-party contestation? I ask this because for the close to over 200 years of America's independence, it's been Republican, Democrat, and that's about it. But from the elections that you contested in, and the word on the ground and the mood on the ground, is there room for this third-party contestation going and looking ahead to 2028?
There's great need for third parties in this country. And the Democrats have shown that they're really not capable of being an opposition party. And they're also not capable of representing the needs of working people. They have broken their promises in the past for $15 minimum wage, for health care as a human right, or even a public option, just a tiny toehold of health care security. They have ignored the housing emergency. So, they have lost support mainly because the public thinks there are only two options. And the system is designed to shut out other options. They keep us off the ballot. The Democratic Party this time around hired an army of lawyers in order to throw opposition off the ballot. And it wasn't just the Green Party, it was all independent parties whose vote counts were pushed down. So we emerged as the strongest among the alternatives, but all of our votes were really pushed down. And the Democrats had what they called a war room, where they were spending more than our entire budget, and they had more staff than we had in our whole campaign, strictly for the purpose of smearing us and disparaging us. So there was enormous effort to this madness. But the result of that is that even more people stayed home than usual. If you look at the polls are very clear that the American people are really hungry for other alternatives, especially for alternatives that will address the public interest and not just that of the super rich and corporations. So we're in a very unstable situation politically, and I think we're going to continue to see even more movement. We're going to see the pressure grow for other alternatives as the American people continue to suffer going forward now.
Dr. Stein, here in South Africa, we also had our elections. The African National Congress, who was in power for 30 years, of course, lost the majority, which forced them to form this government of national unity, or many call it a coalition government. And what it was a strength of democracy that South Africa had. And people, when you look at indexes and polls that were done, for the first time, they really saw democracy and the fruits of it. I would like to think it's probably not the same in America. I say this because we had a discussion with a bunch of political analysts, and a lot of them said that with the American people staying at home, there really isn't a trust in the way democracy is working in America. And the complete opposite of democracy would lead to some sort of, and I know it's a very strong word to use, but some authoritarian style of governance, knowing that you can't have a democracy of America with only Republican and Democrat. Where is the space for other third parties? Is that a concern shared amongst not just American citizens, but academics alike and politicians like yourself also?
It certainly is shared among those who are outside of the circles of power. We have such broad corporate capture now, even in our academic institutions, which, have come to rely on their billionaire donors who influence their policies, including the suppression of free speech on campuses, the suppression of academic freedom, the loss of jobs among academics who dare to speak out and to simply criticize foreign policy, especially on the matter of the genocide going on in Gaza. So, that the repression around genocide, the discussion of genocide, is kind of an indicator of how democracy is not working, and the many institutions that are now under enormous pressure of corporate capture. There's a saying here that goes, who funds you runs you. And because so much wealth and power is now concentrated into the hands of the economic elites, they have enormous power over U.S. institutions. But this is not working. It's not working in terms of the disastrous foreign policies that are really exploding right in front of our eyes, both in the Middle East and also in Russia and Ukraine right now. We're potentially on the verge of a nuclear war there, as well as, the intentions now to to provoke Iran and to allow Netanyahu to expand his war in the Middle East as well. That is a disaster. The economic condition of Americans is also a disaster. So there are enormous rumblings now among the American people who are very unhappy. There's a bigger, I think, rebellion against the two-party system than we have seen, certainly in my political lifetime. And the political parties, the so-called duopoly, they do all that they can to suppress this rebellion. And it's a very fluid situation now. And we'll see which way it goes. But I think there is no suppressing the degree of discontent and suffering among the American people now. So things are definitely going to change.
After the break, and this is where I want to give a lot of the discussion time to America's foreign policy, the genocide in Gaza, and of course, the current impending potential nuclear discussion that is happening in the Russia and Ukraine war. After the break, I continue my conversation with Dr. Jill Stein. Welcome back. Now, a lot of the US presidential discussion has been about the current genocide that is happening in Gaza. You've got Kamala Harris, who said, well, we want a ceasefire, but we will continue as the Democrats to support, quote unquote, our allies, Israel. Donald Trump, on the other hand, was saying, well, we'll see about a potential ceasefire, but we want to flush out the what he terms the jihadists in Gaza, of course referring to Hamas. But he said, my friendship with Israel will continue. And of course, Dr. Jill Stein, my guest today, has been saying that there has to be not only a ceasefire, but a recognition of Palestine and an end to the Israeli occupation. The polls spoke for themselves, Dr. Jill Stein. Kamala Harris, of course, that was the defeat. That was, as one would say, the stroke that hit the camel's back. But the question, Dr. Jill Stein, is why? Why is the United States of America so heavily invested in aiding Israel at the expense of its own citizens? Billions and billions of dollars that's just been thrown to Israel. And yet, there is no real accountability as to why this money is being given to them. It really is a question that not only bemuses people, but angers so many.
It does. And in fact, if you look at the whole military expenditures, and you can say that U.S. policy towards Israel is a symbol of U.S. empire in general. And this costs us over half of our congressional budget. So the cost here to the average American is incredible. It's over $1 trillion a year for the whole military budget, for this policy of full spectrum dominance, this notion that the U.S. shall dominate all regions of the world, especially where there are critical resources at stake. So this policy of military and economic domination consumes over $1 trillion a year in our budget. And according to Jeffrey Sachs, the prominent economist, it's about $12,000 per year per household in the most recent year. And Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Defense answered this question. What he said was, Israel is the unsinkable battleship for the United States in the Middle East, basically a military outpost overseeing the flow of oil in the Middle East. I think it goes a long way to explain the longstanding U.S. relationship with Israel.
That longstanding relationship would obviously date back to the start of the Nakba. And I remember seeing a video of Truman when he mentioned, that, look, this has to be Israel and Israel alone. Not even Reagan, not even the hardliners of Reagan, not even Nixon. I'm even saying this because they were seen as the warmongering presidents, father and son, George Bush Sr., George Bush Jr., were not even this heavily invested in Israel the way Joe Biden has been. And it's coming from a Democrat. How did America, and I know you can't blame each and every citizen, but how has the American political sphere allowed somebody like Joe Biden to clearly say, you know what, Israel, do what you want to do? He himself has even come out, and this has been reported on mainstream media, where he says, I'm a Zionist first before anything else. And just last week, when he was doing a telephone interview with journalists, a journalist asked him, when are you going to negotiate a ceasefire? And he threw a rude comment, which I don't want to mention on air. This US government's not interested in any ceasefire, isn't it? Even the incoming one seems to be really not interested in any discussions on a ceasefire.
Yes, and what I want to point out is that there's a real split here between what the American politicians are doing in both parties and what the American people want. Because if you look at public opinion polls, it's over 68% of Americans who want an immediate ceasefire and a diplomatic solution. And now it is a strong majority, it's well over 60%, who in fact want a weapons embargo imposed on Israel right now in order to achieve that solution. So I would just point out that there's been real corporate capture here, particularly by AIPAC, which in the view of many people is not a legitimate organization, and that if the FARA Act were observed, that is the Foreign Agent Registration Act, that in fact that would be the end of AIPAC right then and there. And hand in hand with the power of AIPAC, you also have the power of the weapons industry. So those two forces have really captured Congress, which is why we need, we need really a reboot of the American political system, which has been captured entirely, and which is devastating not only to the world, to the potential for nuclear war, for the potential for, Netanyahu basically is acting like the commander-in-chief for the United States. This is an utter betrayal of the obligations of the presidency and the White House to the people of the United States. Bibi Netanyahu has zero accountability to the American public, yet he's been given really free rein to drag the U.S. into whatever expanding war that he wants. And this is extremely alarming right now, not only because of the potential for nuclear conflict, the incredible danger of engaging Iran in an all-out war, but also just the sheer costs, the financial costs, the fact that Israel is running out of boots on the ground. They do not have enough people to staff the Israeli occupation forces right now. They are desperate. And meanwhile, Joe Biden has promised that the U.S. would supply boots on the ground and has already begun to do so at a time when the draft has been reactivated, the military draft has been reactivated in this country. So the American people, are not only paying in dollars, they could very well be paying in blood here as well. This is extremely dangerous. It needs to be opposed. You
brought up something there, the reactivation of the draft. I don't know when last this was done. I remember, I was not born that time, but I've watched documentaries of Muhammad Ali, who of course said that, listen, he's not going to fight when it was the Vietnam War. This reactivation of the draft, you've got Donald Trump bringing in hardliners and they voiced their support for Israel in this incoming cabinet, in this current genocide that is happening in Gaza. Is there a sense, and I don't want to use this quite heavily, but the American people really turning on their government and saying, no, we do not want to fight. We see that in Israel right now with the ultra-Orthodox Jewish rabbis saying, we will not fight in this genocide, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in the occupied West Bank. Is there a sense within the American public that they're going to tell their government right now, we will not fight to serve wars that do not benefit us as the American public?
Well, this has everything to do with the fact that the draft was abolished. The draft was abolished after the Vietnam War because the draft so energized the resistance, and that was my political education. I grew up during the Vietnam War, and the ownership over that war was enormous because our generation was paying in blood. So we had nothing to lose and everything to gain by standing up and fighting it. Now we see a generation who is morally activated, and that is a wonder to behold. Now that the draft is back and the potential for boots on the ground is there, I think we will begin to see even greater activation, not only among that generation, but among their relatives, among their parents and so on, and their grandparents. I think the American people already oppose the genocide, and I think if the draft begins to be reactive, I think you're going to see that resistance absolutely go off the charts.
You talk about, obviously, Americans against the genocide. Jewish Voice for Peace, just ahead of the elections, of course, marched onto Wall Street. You've never seen that happening before. As a Jew yourself, Dr. Stein, these movements, these groups standing in solidarity for Palestine. There is good in this world, isn't it? And in the Lord of the Rings, Samwise Gamgee says, "There's good in this world, and it's worth fighting for." There is that ray of hope, isn't it? And if the people power speaks, the people would say, enough is enough. America cannot be complicit in what is happening in Gaza right now.
Exactly. And to look at the polls, the American people share this broadly. It's not just, Jews and Christians, I might add, and people who, believe in human rights. It's basic human values that are at stake here. And the American people have really stood up against incredible repression and threats and police violence. We are standing up. You may get your head bashed in if you stand up and you go to a protest. The police are being extremely violent, and then you have Zionist mobs that are coming out and acting, sometimes in violence as well. This happened especially in UCLA, where at the university, where the police just stood by and let them inflict incredible violence on innocent civilians. So the American people are on the right side of history and the right side of morality here. And this is going to grow, especially because there's an enormous economic price paid as well for this unending imperial budget, of which the genocide is really a symbol. So I think we are going to see the resistance grow, and I'd say hold on to your hat, because you're gonna see a very interesting road ahead now as the American people continue to stand up to fight this.
But I think what's really going to be interesting, Dr. Stein, and you'd agree with me on this, you've got Joe Biden, the departing president, telling Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukrainian president, well, go ahead and use these long-range missiles, and this is a provocation for all-out nuclear war. Is Joe Biden really hitting the final nail in the coffin for the United States of America? I say this because the world's not ready for a nuclear war. Nobody wants a nuclear war. We've got Iran saying that they're willing to discuss with nuclear committees on how they can restrict nuclear supposed work on their facilities. This only infuriates them, not just Iran or Russia, but the entire global South that has nuclear weapons and now has a threat to them by the West, which is instigated by the United States of America, and Joe Biden, who's just got close to 2 months left in office.
Yes, and it's unclear who is running the show, because Joe Biden himself has proven not capable, really, even of running an election or holding a debate. How is he making informed and competent decisions about, nuclear weapons and war in general, to even give the thumbs up on the use of long-range missiles, which is the latest provocation here in this ladder of escalation between the U.S. and Russia. So, it's very problematic, and unfortunately, so many of these opinions are shared, by Republicans, including those who've been appointed or who've been nominated, at any rate, for the cabinet. And Donald Trump himself, remains a real uncertainty. He had suggested during the election that he was going to be a peacemaker in the Middle East, as well as, towards Russia. Now, it's possible he may sit down and negotiate with Putin, and he's given some signs that that may happen. So are Russia and the U.S. willing to go to nuclear detonations here while awaiting for a transition? I think that's the hope, or shall we say that's the rationale. As foolish as it is, I think it's that rationale that enabled the White House, whoever it is that's making decisions there, enabled them to say, sure, why not? Let's use long-range missiles. Missiles. I think they are counting on Russia being restrained here in advance of Donald Trump coming into office. But this is all conjecture. This is all playing with fire. This is all playing with the lives of everyone, because nuclear war, as you know, is never local. Not only that radiation and fallout blows with the wind, but also the phenomenon of nuclear winter, which basically, it's a smoke screen. Essentially, it's a smoke screen high up in the atmosphere where it won't settle down with weather, and it seriously reduces agricultural production. That's essentially what nuclear winter is. And we are all at risk for that, even in a modest exchange of nuclear weapons. So the world should be complying right now with the nuclear ban treaty, which has been brought into force by the United Nations by support from the vast majority of the world's nations. So the world's nations are on board. We need to be getting rid of nuclear weapons, not expanding them, not using modernization to basically further entrench them. We need to get rid of them. And let me add, I think we need reforms in the UN so that the US and the nuclear nations cannot essentially run the show here. There needs to be greater power on behalf of democracy, not only, at the local level here in the United States, I must say, but also, in our international institutions as well.
Well, the Cold War, if it is one, is about to get even more icier. And talking about nuclear repercussions, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Chernobyl, the world cannot afford that to happen again. After the break, we're going to be talking on more foreign policy, but this time on the African continent. South Africa, of course, AGOA, which is a deal between South Africa and the United States in terms of trade. How does Donald Trump come in, given that his relationship with the African continent is not the best of ones? I will conclude my conversation with Dr. Jill Stein after this break. Welcome back to Talking Point. Now, South Africa, of course, had appointed Ibrahim Rasool to be its ambassador in the United States in hopes to go ahead and try and maintain its relationship from an AGOA perspective with the United States of America. Dr. Stein, a lot of the discussion, when the elections were concluded and Donald Trump came in, is that his relationship with the African continent has not really been that great. I want to ask you, because I know that, during your campaigning, you really wanted to establish strong relationships, especially within the global South, whereas you have Donald Trump, who's more keen on America first, and as you mentioned, Israel first, America second, and then, of course, the rest of the world, well, we'll see about them. Is this going to harm America's reputation from a global perspective, given that Africa is continuing to rise, and especially South Africa being quite a major player within global economics and politics at the same time?
Yes, absolutely. And I think we've already seen the U.S. Lose a lot of respect and watch its stature decline internationally, very much because the U.S. is equal partners with Israel. The U.S. is the enabler of the genocide, U.S. weapons, U.S. support for the military, U.S. diplomatic cover, intelligence, and so on. So the U.S. has really joined at the hip with the genocide, and that has, led to an enormous decline in stature. But I think also the U.S. is really held more accountable for its foreign policy right now. And the U.S. foreign policy tends to be extremely self-serving. It tends to be kind of neo-colonialism under a veneer of, a veneer of mutuality when it's really not mutual. And as I understand, there was a recent conference reviewing the AGOA and in South Africa, raising real questions about whether it in fact benefits Africans at all, or is it largely the United States that it's serving? And I know it comes with some strings attached, like needing to support U.S. foreign policy, needing to make progress on certain so-called market-based solutions, which eliminates certain options that some countries may want to pursue. So there are real questions raised about AGOA, and the fact that China has a different kind of foreign policy where there appears to be more mutuality, and China's not just coming in to build military bases, but rather to build infrastructure that's useful to the country. So I think the U.S. Is not is not doing well now, having to really compete, whereas for the last many decades, the U.S. was really the sole dominant global power. It's not anymore. So it's going to be held accountable, and it has to start serving the interests of the world, and especially the countries of the global South as well.
And this G20 summit, when President Cyril Ramaphosa, South Africa's president, of course, spoke on trying to eliminate world hunger, especially hunger here within Africa, he mentioned that the West needs to play its part. And of course, within there, you could have a direct message to the United States of America. For all the flaws of the Democrats, many people have said that it would have been easier from South Africa's perspective to negotiate with the Democrats. It could have been maybe the easier way of talking with Kamala Harris to try and not only maintain AGOA, but find a way of dealing with hunger within the African continent. One senses that maybe Donald Trump may not look at it that way. He may look at it in the fact of, as you said, let me sort my country out. Really, we're not worried about Africa, because that has been, from 2016 to 2020, the rhetoric that Donald Trump really has been saying. And Congress, the Republicans within Congress, support and really hang on to everything that their president says, in not really assisting the African continent.
Yeah. I mean, that does seem to be the case. And as I understand, there is a competing trade agreement which would support, trade among African countries. I haven't followed AGOA closely, so I can't speak in detail. But my impression in general is that the U.S. tends to have rather one-way, self-serving trade agreements, and they tend to serve large corporations, whether they are American or or multinational. It's not the everyday people who are benefiting from development as defined by by U.S. Corporate forces. So personally, I would be quite skeptical of what comes from either Democrats or Republicans, because they both really have a corporate agenda.
Dr. Stein, G20, of course, going to be happening in South Africa next year. It's going to be the final time the Global South is going to be hosting it for quite some time. You've got BRICS that really has taken shape. You've got this discussion of the de-dollarization, which is slowly but surely gaining momentum. You've got within BRICS tons of nuclear powers, the Irans, the China, the Russias, that are there. You've got major players within the fossil fuel industry like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt. They're there. This seems to be a group that is really trying to make sure that unipolarity is the way to go. South Africa has tried to play its part in saying, look, we want to act as a mediator, especially with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because this is a request that has been coming from President Joe Biden to try and make sure that South Africa plays its role. If there is a stubbornness from the Western world, NATO, for example, in not seeing the work that is being done by South Africa in the Global South, how much does BRICS now really start to not only gather momentum, but become this new world order which will not just annihilate the West, but really show that the West has been something of a bygone in the new world era of politics?
I think it's that fact that there is this rising power, which in fact now is a dominant power economically. If you add up all the many nations that are now part of the BRICS alliance, there is more economic power. There's a greater GDP there than what the US and its NATO allies have, or the G20 or whoever. So the economic power has already changed, and that economic power, of course, translates into military power as well. China, for example, is developing its naval forces now much faster than the US is building out new naval armaments. So balance of power is really changing. I think the global reputation of the United States has also really suffered with the genocide. So we are seeing this shift in power. And the question is whether the United States will become an adult in the room and will sign up for a multipolar world. We have come into a multipolar world, and it's either going to be a multipolar world or it's going to be a world that self-destructs as the US attempts to maintain dominance when it absolutely cannot. So, I think the road forward is very clear. It's going to be very bumpy. I think it's getting increasingly bumpy as as the US loses its economic domination. That comes back here at home. We have cheap goods and other benefits that go with the dominance of the dollar, and we're going to be losing that. So there's going to be greater and greater pressure for the United States to step up to the plate, to stop being the bully in the schoolyard, and to join the community of nations in a multipolar world based on diplomacy, international law, and human rights, not on the current foreign policy, the current US foreign policy of economic and military domination. That's clearly the only way forward. And I think there will be growing pressure from that as the American people, become more informed about what the realities are in these choices ahead.
Dr. Stein, we've got 2 or 3 minutes. I want to touch on your political career, of course. Your first contestation within the US elections, of course, have to go back to 2008 when Barack Obama, of course, won that election. You wore the Democratic cap at that time. What is the future of Dr. Jill Stein in the political sphere going forward, looking ahead to 2028? Obviously it's been a disappointing results for you in this year's elections, but when you look at American politics as well, we spoke about third-party representation. Do you feel confident that Dr. Jill Stein with the Green Party can still make a big impact within the American political sphere?
I think the hunger for an independent political party, a choice outside of the parties of war and Wall Street that are really parties that are controlled by those interests, the hunger of the American people for an alternative political party, which is of, by, and for the people, which is a grassroots party that's responsive to everyday people, to working people, not to corporations. There's enormous hunger for that, and I think it's only going to grow going forward. In my own experience, my first race for president was actually in 2012.
Oh, 2012, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the correction.
I had run other races before that, going all the way back to the year 2002. And during that time, we have seen a steady progression. Even in this race over 2020, while our numbers weren't great, it was in a context where all of the numbers, all of the vote counts for alternative parties were extremely suppressed. More and more people were staying home, and it was an election that took place under a great blanket of propaganda and censorship. So the numbers have to be taken with a grain of salt to see the support out there, the support for our campaign, the number of new constituents that are coming into alliance here, including African Americans, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, students, youth in general. There's really been a great expansion of engagement, and it's a much more diversified party. It has much more financial diversity as well. And I think we come out of this stronger than we have ever been before. So personally, I'm very encouraged that we are going in the right direction. And meanwhile, the hunger for exactly what we represent is, expanding exponentially. So I think the future, it won't be without struggle, but I think it's going to be very productive. And I think we very much are, a power of the people. As Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. Well, that demand is developing a political foothold, and we're going to see that grow going forward.
Dr. Jill Stein, I wish we had more time to speak. Unfortunately, we have to come to the end of it. It's been an absolute pleasure hosting you here on Talking Point on Hilaal TV. Hopefully, when you do visit South Africa, you can join us in studio and we can talk more about politics, foreign policy of the United States, and of course, the domestic policy in the United States. Thank you so much for joining us. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much. Great talking with you, Fahraaz.
That's absolute pleasure. That is Dr. Jill Stein, of course, a Green Party leader for the U.S. presidential candidacy that happened this year. Donald Trump, the winner. Interesting to see how, with 2 more months to go until Donald Trump takes up his seat in the White House. That's all we have for you here on Talking Point from myself, Fahraaz Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg. Stay beautiful, South Africa. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.